82-year-old widow's son demands she sell everything, even the cat. What happened next will amaze you. The town of Havenwood, nestled in the rolling hills of Ohio, was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Neighbors greeted each other by name on tree-lined streets. The local bakery filled the air with the scent of warm bread every morning, and the Friday night fish fry at the VFW Hall was a sacred tradition. For Evelyn Miller, Havenwood was more than just a town. It was the backdrop to a life well lived, a tapestry woven with threads of love, loss, and quiet contentment. Evelyn's home, a modest two-story with a porch swing and a garden bursting with colorful blooms, was a reflection of her spirit. It was neat and tidy, filled with the comforting clutter of a life spanning 82 years. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, capturing moments frozen in time. A handsome young man in a military uniform, a laughing bride with a bouquet of wildflowers, a gap-toothed boy holding a fishing rod almost as tall as himself. These were Evelyn's treasures, reminders of her late husband, George, and their son, Michael. But the most vibrant presence in the house, the one that greeted her every morning with a soft purr and a gentle headbutt, was Rusty, her ginger cat. Rusty wasn't just a pet. He was family. George had found him as a tiny, shivering kitten, abandoned near the town's old mill. He'd brought him home to Evelyn, a furry ball of orange fluff that fit in the palm of her hand. "He needs us, Evie," George had said, his eyes twinkling. "And I reckon we need him too." George had been right. Rusty had filled their lives with warmth and laughter. He chased dust bunnies under the furniture, curled up on George's lap during countless evenings of reading, and offered silent comfort to Evelyn when George's health began to fail. Now, years after George's passing, Rusty was her constant companion, a furry anchor in a sea of memories. Evelyn's days followed a gentle rhythm. She woke early, made a pot of coffee, and shared a piece of toast with Rusty, who sat patiently by her feet, his tail twitching in anticipation. She tended her garden, coaxing life from the soil, just as George had taught her. She attended the Wednesday morning service at Havenwood Community Church, her voice joining the chorus of familiar hymns. She met her friends, Sarah and Margaret, for lunch at the Cozy Corner Cafe, where they gossiped about local happenings and shared stories of their grandchildren. There were moments of loneliness, of course. The silence of the house could be deafening at times, especially in the evenings. But Evelyn had learned to embrace the quiet, to find solace in the memories that surrounded her. She would often sit in her favorite armchair, Rusty curled up on her lap, and look through old photo albums, her fingers tracing the faces of loved ones. The only shadow that occasionally fell across her peaceful existence was the absence of her son, Michael. He lived in California, a world away from Havenwood's small-town charm. He'd left home after high school, chasing dreams of success in the big city. His visits had become increasingly infrequent over the years, his phone calls brief and perfunctory. Evelyn tried not to dwell on the distance between them, focusing instead on the occasional postcard or hurried birthday call. She held on to the hope that one day he would return, not just for a visit, but to truly come home. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Evelyn was preparing a pot of her famous apple butter, a recipe passed down from her grandmother, she heard a knock on the door. Rusty, who had been napping in a sunbeam on the windowsill, lifted his head and let out a low growl. Evelyn, her heart skipping a beat, wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. A faded photograph on the wall near the door showed a younger, smiling Michael. She hadn't dared to hope. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was a stranger, yet hauntingly familiar. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders stooped, his face etched with lines that spoke of hardship and regret. His eyes, once bright and full of mischief, were now shadowed and weary. But the sandy blonde hair, though thinning and streaked with gray, and the crooked smile that flickered briefly across his lips, confirmed her deepest fear and, momentarily, her most fervent wish. It was Michael. "Mom!" His voice was raspy, hesitant. Evelyn felt a surge of emotions. Shock, relief, a flicker of joy quickly extinguished by a wave of apprehension. Michael? What are you doing here? He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. I needed to see you. Evelyn stepped aside, inviting him in. The house felt suddenly smaller, the familiar scent of cinnamon and apples overshadowed by a sense of unease. Rusty, who had retreated to the safety of the kitchen, peered out from behind a chair, his fur bristling. Michael stood awkwardly in the living room, his eyes darting around, taking in the familiar surroundings. He looked out of place, a disruptive element in the carefully curated order of Evelyn's life. "Sit down, Michael," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "Tell me what's going on." He sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate and cornered. "I'm in trouble, Mom. Big trouble." Evelyn's heart sank. She had always known, deep down, that Michael's life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned. The infrequent phone calls, the vague excuses for not visiting, the forced cheerfulness in his voice. They had all hinted at a hidden struggle. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then blurted out, "I owe a lot of money. A lot of money." Evelyn closed her eyes, a wave of dizziness washing over her. "How much, Michael?" He named a figure that was staggering, an amount that Evelyn couldn't even comprehend. It was more than the value of her house, more than she had saved in her entire lifetime. "Gambling," he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. "I thought I could win it back. I thought I could fix it. But it just got worse and worse." Evelyn felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She had always known Michael had a weakness for risk-taking, a tendency to chase quick riches. But she had never imagined it would lead to this. "And these people, they're not messing around, Mom. They want their money, and they want it now." Evelyn stood up and walked to the window, her gaze fixed on the familiar sight of her garden, now fading into the twilight hues of autumn. She felt a profound sense of betrayal not just by Michael but by life itself. She had always tried to do the right thing, to be a good wife, a good mother, a good person. And yet, here she was, facing a crisis that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. "What do you want me to do, Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "The house, Mom. We can sell the house." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. The house, her home, the place where she had raised her son, shared countless memories with George, and found solace in her widowhood. It was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a repository of her life. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Absolutely not." Michael jumped up, his desperation turning to anger. "Mom, you don't understand. These people are dangerous. They could." He didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Evelyn felt a surge of fear, not for herself, but for Rusty, who was now huddled under the kitchen table, his eyes wide with terror. "There has to be another way," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We can sell some things, maybe take out a loan." Michael scoffed. "That won't even make a dent in what I owe. The house is the only thing that's worth enough." He paced the room, his agitation growing. "Look, Mom, I know it's not ideal, but it's just a house. You can move into an apartment, somewhere smaller, easier to manage." Evelyn felt a surge of anger rising within her. "This is not just a house, Michael. This is my home. It's where your father and I built our lives. It's where you grew up. It's all I have left." Rusty suddenly darted out from under the table and hissed at Michael. His back arched, his fur on end. Michael recoiled, startled by the cat's sudden aggression. "That damn cat," he muttered. "He always hated me." Evelyn felt a pang of sadness for her son. He had never understood the bond between her and Rusty, the unconditional love that transcended words. The argument continued, escalating in intensity. Michael became more insistent, his voice rising in desperation. Evelyn remained steadfast in her refusal, clinging to her home and the life she had built within its walls. The stalemate seemed unbreakable, the chasm between mother and son wider than ever before. The following days were a blur of tense negotiations, desperate phone calls, and sleepless nights. Michael stayed in the guest room, his presence a constant reminder of the threat hanging over Evelyn's head. He made calls to his creditors, trying to buy time, but his efforts were futile. The pressure was mounting, and his desperation grew with each passing hour. Evelyn, meanwhile, sought advice from anyone she could think of. She spoke to her friend Sarah, who offered sympathy and a shoulder to cry on, but little in the way of practical solutions. She visited the local senior center, where a retired lawyer, Mr. Henderson, volunteered his time. He listened patiently to her story, his brow furrowed with concern. "Mrs. Miller," he said gently, "your son has a legal right to a portion of the house's value, as it's part of your late husband's estate. However, forcing a sale is complicated, especially if you're residing in it. He'd likely need to file a lawsuit, and it could take months, even years, to resolve." Evelyn felt a flicker of hope. "So, he can't just force me out?" Mr. Henderson hesitated. "Not immediately, no. But he could make things very difficult for you. He could contest your ownership, claim you're incapable of managing the property, or even try to have the house condemned if he can find any structural issues." Evelyn's heart sank. The legal jargon was confusing, but the underlying message was clear. Michael had options, and none of them were good for her. She returned home, feeling more vulnerable than ever. Michael was waiting for her, his face pale and drawn. "I talked to them again," he said, his voice hoarse. "They're losing patience. They gave me an ultimatum." Evelyn braced herself. "What kind of ultimatum?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and something darker, something that chilled Evelyn to the bone. They said if I don't have the money by the end of the week, they'll take care of it themselves." Evelyn didn't understand. Take care of what? Michael's gaze shifted to Rusty, who was curled up on the armchair, watching them with wary eyes. "They know about the cat, Mom. They know how much he means to you." Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. "What are you saying, Michael?" He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. They said if I don't pay, they'll make sure the cat disappears." The room spun. Evelyn reached out to steady herself, her hand gripping the back of a chair. The threat was unthinkable, barbaric. It was a direct attack on the most vulnerable part of her heart. "You wouldn't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't let them hurt Rusty." Michael looked away, his silence more damning than any words. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making, and he was willing to sacrifice anything, even his mother's beloved companion, to escape. Evelyn felt a surge of rage, a primal instinct to protect her own. "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house." Michael flinched, but he didn't move. "Mom, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Evelyn said, her eyes blazing. "You're willing to let them hurt an innocent animal to save your own skin. You're no son of mine." She walked to the door and opened it, her hand shaking. "Get out, Michael. And don't come back until you've found your soul." Michael stood there for a moment, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then, without a word, he walked out, leaving Evelyn alone with her fear and her fury. Rusty, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, jumped down from the armchair and rubbed against Evelyn's legs, purring softly. She picked him up, burying her face in his soft fur, tears streaming down her cheeks. The thought of losing him, of him suffering at the hands of those ruthless men, was unbearable. She was alone, facing an impossible situation. Her home, her companion, her very life were all at risk. But she wasn't defeated. She would fight. She would find a way to protect Rusty, to save her home, even if it meant facing her own son. The quiet years were over. The battle had begun. The next morning, Evelyn woke up with a newfound determination. She couldn't wallow in despair. She had to act. She made a pot of coffee, shared her toast with Rusty, who seemed to sense her anxiety and stayed close by her side, and then called Sarah. "Sarah, I need your help," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Sarah, ever the loyal friend, listened patiently as Evelyn recounted the events of the previous night, including Michael's chilling ultimatum. "Oh, Evelyn, that's awful," Sarah exclaimed. "That boy, I just can't believe he'd stoop so low." "I don't know what to do, Sarah," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "I can't lose Rusty. I just can't." Sarah took a deep breath. "We won't let that happen, Evelyn. We'll figure something out. Have you thought about selling some of your belongings? I know it won't be enough to pay off Michael's entire debt, but it might buy you some time. Show him you're making an effort." The idea had crossed Evelyn's mind, but the thought of parting with her possessions, each one imbued with precious memories, was painful. However, the alternative, losing Rusty, was unthinkable. I suppose I could," Evelyn said hesitantly, "but I don't know where to start." "We'll start with a garage sale," Sarah said decisively. "We'll get the word out, put up signs, and see what we can do. It won't be easy, but it's a start." The prospect of opening her home to strangers, of exposing her private life to public scrutiny, was daunting. But Evelyn knew she had no choice. "Okay," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Let's do it." Over the next few days, Evelyn and Sarah worked tirelessly, sorting through years of accumulated belongings. They went through closets, drawers, and attics, unearthing treasures and trinkets, each one holding a story. There was the antique clock that George had painstakingly restored, the set of china they had received as a wedding gift, the handmade quilt that Evelyn's mother had sewn. Each item was a piece of Evelyn's life, a tangible link to her past. Parting with them was like losing a part of herself. She found herself clutching a small porcelain doll, a gift from George on their first anniversary. Tears welled up in her eyes as she remembered the joy of that day, the promise of a lifetime together. Rusty, sensing her sadness, would rub against her legs, purring reassuringly. He seemed to understand that something important was happening, that their quiet life was undergoing a profound change. Sarah, seeing Evelyn's distress, put a comforting arm around her. "It's okay, Evelyn. It's just stuff. The important thing is that you and Rusty are safe." Evelyn nodded, wiping away her tears. Sarah was right. Material possessions were ultimately replaceable. The bond between her and Rusty was not. They set up tables in the garage and on the front lawn, displaying the items they had chosen to sell. Sarah made signs, advertising Evelyn's Treasures garage sale, and posted them around town. They also spread the word through the church and the senior center, hoping to attract as many people as possible. On the morning of the sale, Evelyn woke up with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She looked out the window and saw a small crowd already gathering on her lawn. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers were milling around, examining the items on display. Rusty, perched on the windowsill, watched the scene with curious eyes. He seemed to enjoy the attention, basking in the sunlight and the admiring glances of passers-by. Evelyn took a deep breath and stepped outside, ready to face the day. The sale had begun. The garage sale was a bittersweet experience. On the one hand, it was heartening to see the community rally around Evelyn. Neighbors and friends offered words of encouragement, some even making small donations without buying anything. The sense of solidarity was palpable, a reminder that Havenwood was, at its core, a place of compassion and support. On the other hand, each sale felt like a small loss. Evelyn watched as strangers carried away pieces of her past, items that held sentimental value far beyond their monetary worth. She saw a young couple purchase the antique clock, imagining it ticking away in a new home, marking a different family's time. A teenage girl bought the porcelain doll, perhaps to start her own collection, unaware of the history it carried. Sarah stayed by Evelyn's side throughout the day, offering support and handling the transactions. She was a natural salesperson, charming customers and negotiating prices with a smile. She also kept a watchful eye on Evelyn, making sure she didn't get overwhelmed. Rusty, surprisingly, became the star of the show. He roamed freely among the shoppers, rubbing against legs, purring contentedly, and accepting scratches behind the ears. People were drawn to his gentle nature and his striking ginger fur. He became a symbol of Evelyn's plight, a furry embodiment of her resilience. "He's beautiful," a woman said, stroking Rusty's back. "I can't believe your son would threaten such a sweet creature." Evelyn felt a lump in her throat. "He's my best friend," she said, her voice choked with emotion. The woman nodded sympathetically. "I hope you raise enough money," she said, making a generous donation without buying anything. As the day wore on, Evelyn found herself sharing stories with the shoppers, recounting the history behind the items they were purchasing. She told them about George, about their life together in Havenwood, about Michael's childhood. It was cathartic, a way of preserving the memories even as she let go of the physical objects. A young man, a college student by the look of him, was examining a set of old tools, George's tools. Evelyn recognized the worn handles, the familiar weight of each piece. "These belong to my husband," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He was a carpenter. He could build anything." The young man looked at her with respect. "They're beautiful tools," he said. "I'll take good care of them." Evelyn smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a small comfort knowing that George's legacy would live on, in a way. Despite the steady stream of customers, the money raised was not enough. By the end of the day, they had collected a significant sum, but it was still far short of Michael's debt. Evelyn felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had sold so much, sacrificed so many precious memories, and it still wasn't enough. Sarah counted the money, her face grim. "It's a good start, Evelyn," she said, trying to sound optimistic. "But it's not enough to satisfy your son." Evelyn sighed, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She looked at Rusty, who was curled up asleep on a pile of blankets, oblivious to the financial crisis that threatened their world. "What am I going to do, Sarah?" she whispered. "I don't have anything else to sell." Sarah put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure something out, Evelyn. We always do." But even Sarah's unwavering optimism couldn't completely dispel the cloud of uncertainty that hung over Evelyn. The deadline was looming, and the threat to Rusty was still very real. As Evelyn and Sarah were packing up the remaining items from the garage sale, a young woman approached them. She had a notebook in her hand and a camera slung over her shoulder. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Mrs. Miller?" Evelyn nodded, wary of strangers after Michael's betrayal. "My name is Emily Carter," the young woman said. "I'm a reporter for the Havenwood Gazette. I heard about your situation, and I'd like to write a story about it." Evelyn hesitated. She had always been a private person, reluctant to share her troubles with the world, but she also realized that publicity might be her only hope. I don't know," she said, her voice uncertain. Sarah stepped forward. "It's a good idea, Evelyn. Let her tell your story. It might help." Evelyn looked at Rusty, who was watching them with his usual calm demeanor. She thought about the threat hanging over him, the deadline that was fast approaching. She knew she had to do everything she could to protect him. "Okay," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You can write your story." Emily Carter spent the next hour interviewing Evelyn, listening patiently as she recounted the events of the past few weeks. She took notes, asked questions, and took photographs of Evelyn and Rusty. She seemed genuinely moved by Evelyn's plight, her eyes filled with compassion. "I'll do my best to get your story out there, Mrs. Miller," she said. "I think people will want to help." The article appeared in the Havenwood Gazette 2 days later. It was a front-page story, featuring a large photo of Evelyn and Rusty, their faces etched with worry and determination. The headline read, "Local Widow Faces Eviction, Beloved Cat Threatened." The story recounted Evelyn's situation in detail, highlighting Michael's unfilial behavior and the ruthless tactics of his creditors. It also emphasized Evelyn's deep bond with Rusty, portraying him as her constant companion and a source of comfort in her old age. The article sparked an immediate outpouring of support from the community. People were outraged by Michael's actions and touched by Evelyn's plight. The newspaper's phone lines were flooded with calls from people offering help, donations, and words of encouragement. The story also spread beyond Havenwood, thanks to the internet. A local resident, a young woman named Jessica who had attended the garage sale, created a crowdfunding page for Evelyn, titled Save Evelyn and Rusty's Home. She shared the link on social media, and it quickly went viral. Donations began pouring in from across the country, even from other parts of the world. People were moved by Evelyn's story, by the image of the elderly woman and her ginger cat facing an uncertain future. They shared the link, wrote messages of support, and offered whatever they could to help. Evelyn was overwhelmed by the response. She had never imagined that so many people, most of them complete strangers, would care about her and Rusty. She felt a surge of gratitude, a renewed sense of hope. Sarah, who had been monitoring the crowdfunding page, showed Evelyn the latest updates. "Look, Evelyn," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "You've already raised more than half the amount you need." Evelyn couldn't believe her eyes. The numbers were climbing rapidly, each donation a testament to the kindness and generosity of strangers. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, a tear of gratitude, of relief, of renewed faith in humanity. She had been feeling so alone, so helpless, but now she realized she was surrounded by a community of caring people, all united in their desire to help her and Rusty. The tide was turning. The threat was still there, but now, for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope that she might actually win this fight. The days following the newspaper article were a whirlwind of activity. The crowdfunding page continued to gain momentum, with donations pouring in from all corners of the country. People shared the link on social media, wrote blog posts about Evelyn's story, and even organized local fundraising events. Evelyn received countless letters and emails, filled with messages of support and encouragement. People shared their own stories of beloved pets, of struggles with family, of overcoming adversity. She realized that her situation had resonated with so many people, touching a chord of empathy and compassion. One morning, Evelyn received a phone call from a lawyer in Cleveland, a man named David Thompson. He had read the article about Evelyn and was deeply moved by her story. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice kind and reassuring. "I'm calling to offer my services, pro bono. I'd like to represent you in this matter." Evelyn was stunned. She had never expected such an offer, especially from a lawyer so far away. But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because it's the right thing to do, Mr. Thompson said. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone. And that cat of yours, he deserves to be safe." Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. Having a lawyer on her side, someone who understood the legal complexities of the situation, was a tremendous weight off her shoulders. Mr. Thompson immediately got to work, contacting Michael's creditors and informing them that he was representing Evelyn. He also began investigating Michael's claims to the house, looking for any legal loopholes that might protect Evelyn's ownership. Meanwhile, the community of Havenwood continued to rally around Evelyn. The local church organized a bake sale, the senior center held a bingo night, and the local businesses put out collection jars. Everyone wanted to do their part to help. Michael, who had been laying low since leaving Evelyn's house, was caught completely off guard by the public backlash. He had expected his mother to be an easy target, a vulnerable old woman he could manipulate into selling her home. He had never anticipated the outpouring of support she would receive, the fierce loyalty of her community. The local paper had tried to contact Michael for a statement after the success of the crowdfunding, but he refused. He found himself ostracized by the community, his reputation tarnished. People he had known his whole life were now looking at him with disgust and disapproval. He was facing not only legal challenges but also social condemnation. The pressure was mounting, and Michael began to realize the magnitude of his mistake. He had underestimated his mother's strength, her resilience, and the power of community. He had thought he could get away with his callous behavior, but he was now facing the consequences of his actions. The tide was turning, not just for Evelyn, but against Michael as well. The combination of legal pressure from Mr. Thompson and the overwhelming public outcry proved to be too much for Michael's creditors. They realized they were fighting a losing battle, that their ruthless tactics were only generating more negative publicity. They agreed to negotiate a settlement, a significantly reduced amount that Evelyn could manage with the funds raised through the crowdfunding campaign and community support. Mr. Thompson informed Evelyn of the agreement, his voice filled with satisfaction. "They've backed down, Mrs. Miller," he said. "You and Rusty are safe. You can keep your home." Evelyn felt a surge of relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees. The weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks, the constant fear and anxiety, finally lifted. She could breathe again. She looked at Rusty, who was curled up on her lap, purring contentedly. He seemed to sense that the danger had passed, that their peaceful life was restored. "We did it, Rusty," she whispered, stroking his soft fur. "We won." The news of the settlement spread quickly through Havenwood, sparking celebrations and a collective sigh of relief. The community had come together to protect one of their own, and they had succeeded. Evelyn, overwhelmed with gratitude, wrote a letter to the Havenwood Gazette, thanking everyone who had helped her. She expressed her deep appreciation for the donations, the letters of support, the legal assistance, and the unwavering kindness of strangers. "I have always loved Havenwood," she wrote, "but I never realized how truly special this community is. You have shown me the true meaning of compassion and generosity. You have saved my home, and you have saved my Rusty. I will be forever grateful." The letter was published on the front page, a testament to the power of community and the resilience of the human spirit. As for Michael, the outcome was a mixture of shame and, perhaps, a glimmer of redemption. He had witnessed the overwhelming response to his actions, the public condemnation, and the unwavering support for his mother. He had seen the damage he had caused, the pain he had inflicted. He called Evelyn, his voice hesitant and filled with remorse. "Mom," he said, I'm sorry. I messed up. I really messed up." Evelyn listened, her heart aching for her son, despite everything he had done. She knew he had made terrible choices, but she also knew that he was still her son, and she couldn't completely abandon him. "I know you did, Michael," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But it's not too late to change. It's not too late to make things right." Michael agreed to enter a rehabilitation program for his gambling addiction. He also promised to start paying back the money that had been raised to save Evelyn's home, even though she insisted it wasn't necessary. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but he was finally taking the first steps towards redemption. The ending was bittersweet. Evelyn had saved her home and her beloved Rusty, but the relationship with her son was damaged, perhaps irreparably. However, there was hope. Hope for Michael's recovery, hope for reconciliation, hope for a future where forgiveness might be possible. Evelyn continued to live in her Havenwood home, surrounded by the memories of her past and the unwavering support of her community. Rusty remained her constant companion, a furry symbol of resilience and unconditional love. One sunny afternoon, several years later, Evelyn was sitting on her porch swing, Rusty curled up beside her. She was watching the children play in the park across the street, their laughter echoing through the air. A car pulled up to the curb, and a familiar figure emerged. It was Michael. He looked healthier, more grounded than she had seen him in years. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind that used to grow in her garden when he was a boy. He walked slowly towards her, his eyes filled with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice soft. Evelyn smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Hello, Michael," she said. "Welcome home." Rusty, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, jumped down from the swing and rubbed against Michael's legs, purring softly. Michael reached down and scratched him behind the ears, a small gesture of reconciliation, a symbol of a new beginning. The quiet years had returned, But they were different now. They were richer, deeper, filled with a newfound appreciation for the simple joys of life, the importance of community, and the enduring power of love, even in the face of adversity. The sun set on Havenwood, casting a warm, golden glow on Evelyn's home, a beacon of hope and resilience in a world that often felt too harsh, too unforgiving. But in Havenwood, and in Evelyn's heart, kindness had prevailed, and that, she knew, was all that truly mattered.
A man following an orange cat stumbles upon something that changes everything. The late afternoon sun, beginning its slow descent towards the western horizon, cast long shadows across the ochre and crimson landscape. David Olson breathed deeply, savoring the clean, dry air scented with juniper and dust, a stark contrast to the humid bustle of the city life he'd left behind 2 years ago upon retiring. At 61, a former geologist whose career had involved deciphering the Earth's deep history, David now found solace in exploring its surface narratives, camera often in hand, hiking the myriad trails that spiderweb through the red rock country surrounding his small home near Sedona. He preferred the less traveled paths, the ones that wound away from the main tourist viewpoints, leading into quiet canyons and up onto secluded mesas, where the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through pinon pines or the cry of a distant hawk. He wasn't antisocial precisely, but decades spent deciphering silent stones had perhaps inclined him towards the non-human world for companionship. His wife, Sarah, had passed before they could make this move they'd long dreamed of, and the quiet beauty of this landscape held both the sharp pang of her absence and a profound grounding peace. Today, he'd ventured further than usual, following a faint game trail that branched off from a marked Forest Service path, intrigued by a series of unusual rock formations he'd spotted from a ridge the previous week. The trail dwindled, becoming rougher, forcing him to pick his way carefully over loose scree and around prickly pear cacti standing sentinel in the sandy soil. He consulted his map and GPS periodically. He was an experienced hiker, respectful of the wilderness and its potential dangers. It was as he navigated a narrow wash, flanked by steep, striated canyon walls, that he first saw the cat. It was an orange tabby, startlingly bright against the muted desert palette, perched on a sun-warmed boulder just ahead. It wasn't a large cat, and it looked lean, almost skinny, its fur having the slightly rough, dusty appearance of an animal living wild, or at least semi-feral. David stopped, surprised. Domestic cats weren't unheard of near the fringes of town, often strays or barn cats from outlying properties. But it was unusual to see one this deep into the more rugged backcountry. He reached slowly for his camera, hoping for a quick shot before it bolted. But the cat didn't bolt. Instead, it turned its head, fixed him with intelligent green eyes, and let out a distinct, demanding meow. Then it hopped down from the boulder, trotted a few yards further up the wash, stopped, looked back at David, and meowed again, more insistently this time, flicking its tail. David lowered his camera, puzzled. This wasn't typical stray cat behavior. It wasn't approaching him for food, nor was it fleeing in terror. It seemed expectant, agitated almost. "Hello there," David said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "Lost, are you?" The cat responded with another meow, then turned and trotted another 10 yards up the wash, disappearing briefly around a bend before peeking back out, its gaze locked on him. It repeated the pattern: meow, move, look back, it felt uncannily like the cat wanted him to follow. David hesitated. His geologist's mind urged caution. Pursuing wildlife, especially behaving oddly, wasn't wise. But his curiosity, the trait that had served him well in his career, was undeniably piqued. The cat didn't look rabid or aggressive, just purposeful and intensely focused on him. Was it injured? Did it have kittens hidden somewhere it needed help with? Or was it simply habituated to hikers, associating humans with potential handouts, employing a peculiar strategy to lure him closer? Against his better judgment, intrigued by the small mystery, David decided to follow, at least for a little way. "All right," he murmured, adjusting his small backpack. "Show me what's so important." He walked up the wash, keeping a respectful distance. The cat stayed ahead, leading him away from the faint game trail, scrambling over rocks and through dry brush with surprising agility despite its lean frame. It consistently paused, looked back, meowed as if to ensure he was still coming, then continued onward, deeper into the rugged terrain towards a series of imposing sandstone cliffs that rose abruptly from the canyon floor. The area felt remote, untouched, the silence profound. David glanced at his GPS. He was well off any marked path now, in an area he hadn't explored before. Prudence suggested turning back, but the cat's strange insistence, combined with the allure of the unexplored terrain, kept him moving forward. The orange cat, a small, determined guide, led him on, towards the silent, watchful cliffs looming ahead. The orange cat led David towards the base of the towering sandstone cliff, its ancient face carved by millennia of wind and water into dramatic overhangs and shadowed alcoves. The air grew cooler here, shielded from the direct afternoon sun. The cat, still meowing intermittently and glancing back, finally stopped near a dense curtain of wild grapevines clinging tenaciously to the rock face, obscuring whatever lay behind. With a final insistent meow directed at David, the cat slipped effortlessly through a small gap in the vines and vanished. David approached the spot, his curiosity now fully ignited. He pushed aside the thick, leafy vines, revealing a narrow, dark opening in the cliff, not much taller than himself. Perhaps a natural fissure, widened slightly by erosion, or maybe something more. A draft of cool, slightly damp air, carrying the scent of dry dust and something indefinably ancient, flowed out from the opening. He hesitated. Entering unknown caves or crevices alone was high on the list of things experienced hikers didn't do. Snakes, unstable rocks, disorientation. The risks were numerous. Yet, the cat's strange behavior, leading him directly to this hidden spot, felt too significant to ignore. Where had it gone? Was this its den? He retrieved the powerful flashlight from his backpack, taking a deep breath, telling himself he would only go a few feet just to see. He ducked under the low overhang and stepped through the opening. Inside, the transition was immediate and profound. The bright desert sunlight vanished, replaced by a cool, deep gloom. The air was still, silent, holding the kind of absolute quiet that only exists deep within the earth or far from human habitation. He switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating a space larger than he expected. Not a deep cave network, but a wide, shallow rock shelter, perhaps 30 feet across and extending maybe 20 feet back into the cliff face. The floor was sandy, littered with small stones and dry leaves blown in over centuries. And then, as he swept the flashlight beam slowly across the back wall, his breath caught in his throat. The smooth, ochre surface of the sandstone wasn't blank. It was covered in figures, etched and pecked into the rock face, brought into sharp relief by the oblique angle of his flashlight beam. Petroglyphs, ancient drawings. He stepped further in, mesmerized, playing the light across the panel. There were human-like figures with elaborate headdresses, stylized animals, deer with intricate antlers, birds in flight, serpents winding across the stone, and complex geometric patterns whose meanings he could only guess at. The artistry was stunning, the lines confident, imbued with a palpable sense of energy and belief. Some figures were faded, eroded by time, but many were remarkably clear, preserved by the shelter's protection from the elements. David, the geologist turned amateur photographer, felt a thrill course through him, quickly followed by a profound sense of awe and reverence. He recognized the style vaguely, similar perhaps to Sinagua or ancestral Puebloan art he'd seen in museums or documented sites, but with unique elements, a distinct local dialect in the universal language of rock art. This felt different, undisturbed. He swept the beam across the floor. Amidst the sand and debris, he spotted them. Fragments of worked stone, possibly tool remnants, and small shards of pottery. Their painted patterns faded, but still discernible. Near the back wall, a darker patch on the floor suggested an ancient fire pit. This wasn't just a gallery. It was a place where people had lived, worked, perhaps sought shelter, or performed ceremonies centuries, maybe millennia ago. And the cat? He directed his beam towards the sides of the shelter. He saw no sign of the orange tabby, no bedding, no den. Perhaps it had slipped out through another crevice, or maybe its territory was just the area outside the entrance, and leading him here was pure, bizarre coincidence. His attention returned to the wall. He traced the beam over a particularly intricate panel depicting a hunting scene. Then, lower down, near the floor, he saw another set of figures, smaller, more crudely etched perhaps, but unmistakable. Cats. There were several of them, depicted with arched backs and long tails, sometimes interacting with human figures, sometimes positioned near granary symbols. Were they bobcats or pumas, common in this region? Some looked like it, but one figure, remarkably clear, had a different posture, more relaxed, closer to a human figure depicted almost as a companion. It even had faint etchings near its body that could, with imagination, suggest stripes or spots, though interpreting color from pecked rock was impossible. It was clearly a feline, rendered with an intimacy that suggested familiarity, perhaps even affection. David stared at that particular petroglyph, his mind racing. Domestic cats weren't thought to be prevalent in pre-Columbian southwestern cultures in the same way as dogs or turkeys. Finding clear depictions suggesting companionship was unusual, potentially significant. He spent perhaps 20 minutes inside, moving slowly, careful not to disturb anything, taking careful photographs with his camera, using only the ambient light near the entrance and the brief illumination of his flashlight to capture the images on the walls and the scatterings on the floor. He knew instinctively this place was important, unknown, undocumented as far as he knew. The weight of the discovery settled upon him. This wasn't just a casual find, it was a window into a lost world, a tangible link to people who had lived and worshipped and perhaps cherished feline companions on this very spot centuries ago. The awe he felt was now mixed with a sense of profound responsibility. This place needed to be protected, studied, understood. He backed out slowly, carefully replacing the vines to obscure the entrance as best he could, though he knew that wouldn't be enough long term. He marked the location precisely on his GPS, took careful note of landmarks. As he stepped back out into the now shadowed wash, the orange cat was nowhere to be seen. Had it ever really been leading him? Or was it just a random encounter, a catalyst for a discovery waiting to be made? It didn't matter, David decided, as he started the hike back towards the marked trail, his mind buzzing. The cat, intentionally or not, had brought him here. It had been the key, the echo, that opened a door into the deep stone heart of the past. The hike back to the main trail and then onwards to his parked truck felt entirely different. The familiar landscape seemed charged with new significance, the silent stones now whispering secrets David had been privileged to glimpse. He felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and heavy responsibility. He had stumbled upon something potentially invaluable, something that belonged not to him, but to history, and perhaps more directly, to the descendants of the people who created it. His immediate priority was to ensure its protection and report it properly. Back home, the first thing David did, after pouring himself a much-needed glass of water, was carefully downloading the photos from his camera onto his computer. He zoomed in, studying the details he'd captured, the expressive figures, the intricate patterns, the pottery shards, the intriguing cat petroglyph. Seeing them again on the screen confirmed the significance of the find. This wasn't just a few random markings. It looked like a coherent, well-preserved site. His next step was figuring out who to contact. As a retired geologist with experience working on public lands, he knew the importance of following protocol. This area, while remote, was likely under the jurisdiction of the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, BLM. He also knew that local universities often had archaeology departments with expertise in the region. He decided the best approach was to contact both the relevant land management agency and the archaeology department at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, known for its work on southwestern prehistory. He spent the evening carefully composing emails, drafting a concise description of the site's location using GPS coordinates and descriptions relative to known landmarks, the nature of the findings, petroglyphs, potential artifacts, and emphasizing the apparent undisturbed condition and the need for immediate assessment and protection. He attached a few carefully selected, non-specific photos, enough to show the significance without revealing precise details that could attract unwanted attention if the email was misdirected. He stressed his desire to cooperate fully and ensure the site was handled respectfully and professionally. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the unusual behavior of the orange cat that had drawn his attention to the area, though he framed it more as a curious coincidence than a mystical guide. He sent the emails off, feeling a sense of nervous anticipation. Would they take his report seriously? Would they act quickly? The response, when it came 2 days later, was swift and affirmative. Both the BLM field office and the university archaeology department expressed significant interest. Dr. Elena Ramirez, a respected archaeologist from NAU specializing in regional rock art and settlement patterns, contacted him directly. Her voice crackled with professional excitement over the phone as David described his findings in more detail. "Mr. Olson, what you're describing sounds potentially very significant," she said. "Undocumented rock art sites of this nature are increasingly rare, especially ones with associated artifacts suggesting habitation or ceremonial use. The feline depictions you mentioned are particularly intriguing. Could you possibly guide us to the location?" David readily agreed. A few days later, he met Dr. Ramirez and two of her graduate students, along with a BLM archaeologist ranger, near the trailhead where his hike had begun. He led them back along the route, recounting the story of following the orange cat, pointing out the turnoff onto the faint game trail, and finally guiding them up the wash to the vine-covered opening. Dr. Ramirez and her team approached the site with meticulous care. They examined the entrance, the surrounding geology, and the types of vegetation. Before entering, they conducted a brief, informal blessing, acknowledging the ancestors who might have used this place. A gesture of respect David deeply appreciated. Inside the rock shelter, their professional excitement was palpable but controlled. They moved slowly, using specialized lights, careful not to disturb the floor surface. They documented everything with cameras, notebooks, and mapping tools. Dr. Ramirez examined the petroglyphs with a practiced eye, murmuring observations about technique, style, potential dating based on weathering, and iconography. "The style has elements consistent with late basket maker or early Pueblo periods, perhaps," she mused, studying a complex geometric pattern. "But some of these figures, particularly the anthropomorphs and the feline representations, they have unique characteristics. This could represent a local variation, or perhaps something slightly older or culturally distinct we haven't fully documented in this specific canyon system yet." They spent hours inside, the archaeologists working with focused intensity, while David and the BLM ranger observed, ensuring the site remained secure. David felt a quiet thrill watching them work, seeing the fragments he had stumbled upon beginning to be pieced together into a coherent story by expert hands. As they prepared to leave just before dusk, carefully securing the entrance again and discussing plans for future, more intensive and permitted documentation and perhaps excavation, Dr. Ramirez turned to David. "You found something truly special here, Mr. Olson," she said, her eyes shining. "Thank you for reporting it so responsibly. This site has the potential to significantly enhance our understanding of the people who lived in these canyons centuries ago, including their relationship with the natural world, and perhaps specifically with cats." Walking back out under the emerging stars, David felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The echoes in the stone were beginning to speak, thanks to a curious man following a persistent orange cat. The past was slowly, carefully being unveiled. The weeks that followed the initial site visit were filled with a quiet hum of activity, at least from David's perspective. Dr. Ramirez and her team secured the necessary permits for a more thorough investigation, working closely with the BLM and consulting with tribal historic preservation offices from affiliated Native American groups whose ancestors had inhabited the broader region. David, at their request, guided them back to the site several times, sharing his initial observations and photographs. He felt a sense of proprietorship, not of ownership, but of stewardship, towards the hidden rock shelter and its secrets. The archaeological team worked with painstaking care. They established a grid system on the shelter floor, meticulously documenting the location of every pottery shard, every stone flake, every charcoal fleck from the ancient hearth. Samples were carefully collected for dating, radiocarbon for the charcoal, thermoluminescence for the pottery shards. They used specialized photography techniques, including digital image enhancement and reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, to reveal fainter details in the petroglyphs, bringing out nuances invisible to the naked eye. As the data accumulated, a fascinating picture began to emerge. The site, which they informally dubbed Echo Shelter at David's suggestion after the cat, appeared to be older than initially suspected, potentially dating back over 1,000 years, perhaps to the transition between the late archaic hunter-gatherer period and the early agricultural settlements in the region. The artifacts and art style suggested a small, possibly semi-nomadic group that utilized the shelter seasonally or for specific ceremonial purposes. They seemed related to known regional cultures, but possessed distinct local traditions. Most intriguing, the evidence for a unique relationship with felines grew stronger. Careful analysis of faunal remains, animal bones, found minuscule fragments indicating the presence of cats within the shelter. Not just wild bobcats or pumas, sometimes depicted as powerful spiritual beings or prey, but bones more consistent in size with smaller felines, possibly early domesticated or tamed wildcats living in close proximity to humans. The petroglyphs depicting cats were analyzed intensively. While many clearly showed stylized wild felines, several, including the one David had first noticed, seemed different. They lacked the overt ferocity often portrayed in puma images. Instead, they were shown near human figures, sometimes curled at their feet, sometimes near depictions of dwellings or storage areas. Dr. Ramirez hypothesized that these people might have had a unique, early relationship with cats, perhaps encouraging them for rodent control around food stores, which gradually evolved into a form of companionship or semi-domestication specific to this isolated group. "It's fascinating," Dr. Ramirez explained to David during one of his visits to observe the ongoing work. The timeline is potentially earlier than widespread evidence for cat domestication in this part of the Southwest. This group might have independently fostered a relationship with local smaller felines, or perhaps they represented an offshoot group that maintained traditions lost elsewhere. The art suggests cats held a special place, not just as wild predators, but as beings integrated into their daily or ceremonial lives. She showed him enhanced images of the specific cat petroglyph that had first caught his eye. The RTI imaging revealed more detail, faint lines suggesting patterned fur, a posture that conveyed watchful stillness rather than wildness. "Objectively," she cautioned, "we can't say it looks like your orange cat, Mr. Olson. We can't know the color, and the style is highly symbolic. But," she smiled, "it is a particularly clear and compelling depiction of a cat sharing space with humans. It represents the very bond you experienced in a way when your feline guide led you here." David felt a thrill hearing her confirm the significance. The whispers of these forgotten people were growing clearer, telling a story of resilience, adaptation, and a connection with the feline world that felt surprisingly modern, echoed across a millennium. He thought of the skinny orange cat, Echo, whose strange behavior had been the catalyst. Whether by intent or pure serendipity, Echo had unveiled not just a place, but a relationship, a shared history between humans and cats etched into the enduring stone. The forgotten people of Echo Shelter had left their mark, and now, thanks to a curious man and a persistent cat, their story was finally beginning to be heard again. While the archaeologists meticulously documented the whispers of the past within Echo Shelter, David Olson found himself increasingly concerned with the living Echo, the skinny orange cat that had led him there. He hadn't seen Echo during the initial archaeological visits, likely scared off by the increased human activity near its territory. David worried about the cat. Had it been displaced? Was it finding enough food now that its familiar grounds were disturbed? He felt a peculiar sense of responsibility towards the animal. Echo was inextricably linked to the discovery, the living key that had unlocked the hidden shelter. David couldn't just forget about him now that the experts had taken over. He started making quiet visits to the area around the shelter entrance in the late afternoons. After the archaeologists had usually packed up for the day, he'd sit quietly on a boulder some distance away, watching and waiting. For several days, he saw no sign of the cat. He began leaving small offerings of dry cat food tucked discreetly under a sheltering juniper bush, well away from the protected archaeological zone, but along paths the cat might still use. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the cliffs in fiery colors, he saw him, a flash of orange moving cautiously through the brush near the base of the cliff. Echo. He looked as lean as ever, perhaps even more skittish, his green eyes wide as he scanned the area. He spotted David sitting on the boulder, but didn't bolt immediately. He watched him, head tilted, a low, questioning meow carrying on the still air. David didn't move, didn't speak. He simply sat, projecting calm. After a long moment, Echo seemed to decide David wasn't a threat. He approached the juniper bush, where David had left the food earlier, sniffed tentatively, and then began to eat quickly, nervously glancing towards David between mouthfuls. This became their new routine. David would leave food in the same spot each late afternoon. Echo would appear, usually after David had settled quietly nearby, eat the offering, and sometimes linger for a few minutes, grooming himself or watching David with that intense, unreadable gaze before melting back into the rocks and shadows. David never tried to approach Echo directly, never tried to touch him. He understood this was likely a semi-feral cat, valuing its independence, its wildness shaped by necessity. His role, he felt, was simply to provide unobtrusive support, a reliable source of sustenance, as a thank you for the incredible gift of discovery Echo had inadvertently given him. He spoke occasionally with Dr. Ramirez about the cat. She was sympathetic, understanding the unique connection David felt. They agreed that as long as David's feeding station was well away from the archaeological site itself and didn't interfere with the team's work, it posed no harm. In a way, Dr. Ramirez had mused, it seems fitting. Perhaps he really is connected to this place somehow. Over weeks, then months, Echo grew noticeably less skittish in David's presence. He would still wait for David to settle before approaching the food, but he no longer seemed overtly fearful. He would sometimes sit nearby after eating, watching David with slow blinks, almost companionably. The distance between them, both physical and psychological, was slowly shrinking. One cool autumn afternoon, David brought a small can of wet food as a treat along with the kibble. He opened it and placed it near the usual spot. Echo approached, sniffed appreciatively, and began to eat. As the cat ate, David spoke softly, telling him about the archaeologists' progress, about the theories regarding the ancient people and their feline companions. Echo, naturally, paid no attention to the words, focused on his meal, but the low, calm tone of David's voice seemed to soothe him. When Echo finished eating, instead of immediately retreating, he walked slowly towards the boulder where David sat. He stopped just a few feet away, looked up at David, and gave a distinct, soft chirp, almost like a thank you, before turning and padding silently away towards the cliffs. David watched him go, a warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't domestication, not yet. Perhaps never. But it was trust, a fragile bridge built across the divide between human and wary feline, built with patience, respect, and shared presence near a place where echoes of a similar ancient bond resonated from the stone. David felt content. He was helping to protect the past revealed within the shelter, and he was honoring the living creature, the unlikely guide who guarded its edge. The news of the discovery at Echo Shelter eventually became public knowledge, carefully managed by the BLM and the university to protect the site while sharing its significance. It generated considerable excitement, not just locally, but in wider archaeological circles, particularly the compelling evidence for the early unique relationship between the shelter's ancient inhabitants and cats. Articles were written, presentations given. The forgotten people began to reclaim a small space in the historical narrative of the region. Through it all, David Olson remained quietly involved. He had developed a strong working relationship with Dr. Ramirez and her team, occasionally assisting with site monitoring or sharing his detailed knowledge of the surrounding terrain. He became an unofficial but deeply committed steward of the place, his regular hikes now often including a respectful detour to check on the shelter's vicinity, ensuring no unauthorized access or vandalism occurred. And his bond with Echo deepened. The orange cat, now assured of regular meals and familiar with David's quiet presence, grew bolder, healthier. His coat took on a brighter sheen, and he filled out slightly, though he retained the lean, weathered look of a survivor. He still lived wild, likely denning somewhere in the complex network of crevices around the shelter, but his territory now clearly included David. He would often appear when David approached the area, sometimes trotting out to meet him on the faint trail, meowing a greeting. He would sit companionably nearby while David rested or took photographs. On rare occasions, usually when David brought the treat of wet food, Echo would even allow a brief, tentative touch, a quick scratch behind the ears, a gentle stroke down his back, before moving gracefully away, maintaining his essential wildness, yet acknowledging the connection. David never tried to lure Echo home, never attempted to fully domesticate him. He respected the cat's nature, its intrinsic link to the wild landscape where he belonged, the landscape that held the secrets Echo had helped unveil. Their relationship existed on the cat's terms, a quiet understanding forged at the edge of the wilderness, near the echoes of the ancient past. Sometimes, researchers or carefully supervised tour groups visiting the now protected Echo shelter site would catch a glimpse of the bright orange cat patrolling the cliff base or sunning himself on a high ledge. Dr. Ramirez often shared the story of the shelter's discovery, always giving credit to the curious orange cat who acted as David's unlikely guide. Echo, unaware of his fame, became a small legend, fondly referred to by the archaeologists and David as the guardian of Echo Shelter. One clear, cool spring morning, exactly a year after his first discovery, David sat on his familiar boulder near the shelter entrance, sharing the quiet landscape with Echo, who was dozing peacefully a few feet away in a patch of sun. The archaeologists had finished their main phase of documentation, and the site was now quiet again, protected and awaiting further long-term study. David looked from the sleeping cat towards the hidden cave entrance, thinking about the ancient people who had lived there, who had perhaps shared their lives, their fires, their stories with feline companions much like Echo. He felt an almost mystical connection, a sense of time collapsing, the past breathing quietly in the present. The discovery of Echo Shelter hadn't just been an intellectual thrill. It had given his retirement a profound sense of purpose, connecting him deeply to the history of the land he loved and to the small, resilient creature who embodied its wild spirit. Echo stirred, stretched, and blinked his green eyes open, looking directly at David. He let out a soft chirp, then began to groom his bright orange fur meticulously in the warm sunlight. David smiled. He didn't need Echo to be a mystical guide or a conscious guardian. He was simply Echo, a wildcat who had survived, who had inadvertently revealed a hidden treasure, and who had, through patience and quiet persistence, formed an unlikely bond with a solitary human. That was a miracle enough. He sat there for a long time, sharing the comfortable silence with the cat, feeling the ancient echoes in the stones around him and the quiet pulse of living history beside him. The geologist who studied deep time had found his most profound connection in the present moment, linked to the distant past by the simple, trusting presence of an orange cat sunning himself at the edge of the wilderness.